Some photographs preserve memory. The Thornfield album preserves something that should never have existed at all. For 70 years, one family posed for joy, while a stranger they never named stood eternal in the frame. The photograph should have been ordinary. A wedding in 1854, captured in the stiff, solemn poses of its time. The Thornfield family of rural Arkansas had gathered in their best attire, the bride in pale satin, the groom in a tailored coat, and behind them, rows of relatives who had come to mark the union. Their faces are sharp in the grain of the image, some blurred slightly by movement, others locked in expressions that seem almost carved into glass. At first glance, it is no different from the countless portraits preserved from that decade, but a closer look reveals what should not be there. To the far right of the frame, slightly detached from the bridal party, stands a man whose presence no one can account for. He is tall, thin, his complexion washed almost white by the photographic process, his expression unreadable. Unlike the others, he does not lean toward the camera or angle himself toward the couple. He faces forward, gaze fixed beyond the lens, as though looking directly at whoever dares to study the print decades later. In family notes, every person in the portrait is named, from the distant cousins to the neighboring pastor. Every person but him, his identity is absent, and yet his figure is impossible to ignore. The photo, preserved in the Thornfield family album, would later become the center of whispers. At the time of its taking, it was filed away without comment, one image among many documenting the rise of the family's prominence. But when subsequent weddings were held, and the album was updated, an unsettling pattern emerged. In 1861, 1872, 1889, and on through the turn of the century, every wedding portrait bore the same pale man, unchanged. He appeared in different positions each time near the bride, behind the groom, at the edge of the group, but his face, clothing, and posture remained eerily consistent. He never aged, never altered, and never once appeared in family records. By the early 1900s, relatives were reluctant to discuss the photos. Guests who recalled attending the weddings claimed no memory of such a man standing among them. Yet in the photographs he was always there, as visible and undeniable as the bride herself. Some suggested a photographic error, a ghost of an overexposed plate. But analysis of the surviving images shows no tampering, no accident of light. The man is rendered with the same sharpness as every other figure, his shadow falling where it should, his form as solid as the rest. The Thornfield album should have been a record of joy, of unions and beginnings. Instead, it became a ledger of something unexplainable, a witness who never left, a figure who stood in silence as generations wed beneath his gaze. It was not merely a photograph. It was the first trace of a presence that would haunt the family for the next 70 years. The Thornfield name carried weight in the Arkansas River Valley of the mid-19th century. When the family's patriarch, Elias Thornfield, settled on a vast stretch of land in the early 1800s, he built not only a plantation, but an image of permanence. By 1854, the year of the first surviving wedding portrait, the Thornfields were counted among the most prosperous landowners in the region. Their estate was a symbol of stability, with wide fields that stretched toward the horizon, and a grand house whose brick facade caught the sunlight like a beacon of wealth. They were respected, even envied, for the appearance of success. The Thornfields were also known for their devotion to the church. Sundays found them seated in the front pew, polished and proper, a model of piety for the community that grew up around them. They donated generously to church renovations, paid for hymnals, and ensured their family's name was etched into every ledger that mattered. It was said that no town festival or parish event could succeed without a Thornfield at its center. Their daughters married into other prominent families, and their sons were groomed to inherit both the land and the expectations of leadership. Their weddings became the defining spectacles of the valley. Guests traveled for miles to attend, sometimes arriving days in advance. The ceremonies were celebrated beneath lanterns strung from oak trees, the receptions echoing with fiddles and the stomp of boots on wooden floors. Local newspapers wrote of the lavish meals served at Thornfield weddings, of the imported fabrics worn by brides, and of the way the family's gatherings seemed to set the rhythm for social life in the county. To marry a Thornfield was to step into prominence, and the photographs taken on those days were treasured reminders of the family's reach and reputation. Yet the albums that survived tell a different story. Leafing through the pages of heavy, leather-bound volumes, preserved by descendants, one finds not only smiling couples and proud parents, but the unsettling constancy of a figure no one admitted to knowing. The Thornfields, who otherwise documented their lives with meticulous care, avoided any mention of the anomaly. Names were carefully written beneath each photograph in looping cursive tracing branches of kinship across generations. Only one figure remained unnamed, yet never absent. He was there in 1854, and he would be there in 1861, 1872, 1889, and beyond. His presence, as much a part of the family record as the Thornfields themselves, was met with silence. Neighbors whispered, of course. They wondered why no one in the family ever spoke of the man who appeared in every wedding portrait. But to ask directly was to invite cold dismissal. The Thornfields had built their power on a mixture of generosity and quiet menace. What they chose not to acknowledge, others quickly learned not to question. And so the albums remained on display in parlors and sitting rooms, their pages turned by visitors who noticed the pale figure but dared not ask. In time, the silence itself became tradition, just another inheritance passed down with the land and the photographs, an unspoken rule that the Thornfields' prosperity came with shadows that could not be named. When the Thornfield wedding album is examined carefully, page by page, the pattern becomes undeniable. At first, the viewer notices only the fashions changing with time, the stiff collars of the 1850s giving way to the looser styles of the 1870s, the shifting silhouettes of gowns, the growing number of children posed at the edges of the frames. Faces come and go, relatives age and are replaced by the next generation, yet one figure remains absolutely constant. He is never in the center of the photograph, never introduced with flourish, but always present. A man who does not smile, does not alter, and is never named in the captions written carefully beneath each image. In the earliest photograph from 1854, he stands slightly apart, his clothing indistinct in the faded silver tones of the print. His gaze is steady, his posture rigid. Decades later, in the wedding portrait of 1872, the bride and groom are flanked by proud parents and neighbors. Yet, there he is again, this time at the back row, his pale face visible between two cousins. By the 1890s, he has moved to the far left of the group, hands folded neatly before him. In 1907, he appears closer to the front, positioned as though he belongs among the immediate family. The most striking detail across these portraits is that he never seems to change. His face, lean and hollowed at the cheeks, is the same from one decade to the next. His hair, dark and neatly combed, never recedes, never whitens. He does not age as the others do. The captions beneath the images offer no answers. Our wedding day, March 1854. Jonathan and Mary, 1872. Clara's union, June 1889. Every figure is named except him. The children are noted, the clergy identified, even distant cousins from neighboring counties are carefully recorded in looping cursive. But the man always present, always visible, remains unacknowledged. It is as though he were invisible to those who lived alongside him, a presence caught only by the camera's unflinching eye. Over the years, Descendants leafing through the album would pause, their fingers hovering over the pale figure in each frame. Some would laugh nervously and suggest it must have been a farmhand or a guest forgotten by history. Others said nothing at all, closing the album and setting it back on the shelf with more force than necessary. For those who studied it closely, however, unease settled quickly. Photographs can lie, but not like this. Light may distort, negatives may blur, but a single man cannot remain unchanged for 70 years. The stranger in the frame became the silent witness to every Thornfield wedding. He stood as couples pledged their futures, as families expanded, as generations turned. Always watching, never aging, never speaking, a figure unclaimed by history yet immortalized in every image. His presence was not an accident, nor a trick of the glass. It was a pattern, deliberate or otherwise, a signature left upon the family record that no one dared to explain. By the late 19th century, the Thornfields' reputation was no longer built only on their wealth and their generosity to the church. It was shadowed by whispers that spread quietly through the valley. Murmurs passed in kitchens, general stores, and among field hands when the family could not hear. People spoke of the photographs, though few admitted to having seen them directly. Visitors to the estate who glimpsed the albums carried tales back into town, and from there the stories multiplied. What should have been the pride of the Thornfield legacy, their grand weddings, their documented history became instead the seedbed of rumor. Neighbors began to say the family was cursed. They pointed to the pale stranger who appeared in every photograph, a man who never changed as the years passed. Some insisted he must be a Thornfield ancestor, perhaps Elias Thornfield's brother, who according to local lore had died in violent circumstances before the estate was fully built. It was said he had been crushed beneath a carriage or shot in a quarrel over land, depending on who told the story. His unfinished business, they claimed, had tethered him to the family, forcing him to stand in silent witness at every union that carried the Thornfield name forward. To marry into the Thornfields, the rumor went, was to bind yourself not only to their land, but to the gaze of the dead. Others rejected this explanation. They claimed the man was no relative at all, but something darker, a debt collector of the soul bound to the family by a pact made generations earlier. Some swore that, in the orchard behind the estate, an oath had been spoken, trading prosperity for a presence that could never be banished. The figure in the photographs, they said, was the enforcer of that oath, appearing not to bless the weddings, but to mark the living for what was owed. Children in the valley turned the stories into games, daring one another to walk past the Thornfield house at night and peer into the windows, hoping to glimpse the pale man watching from within. Farmers avoided the road that ran past the orchard after dark, muttering that they had seen a tall figure standing among the trees, unmoving, waiting. The Thornfields themselves dismissed such tales, maintaining their veneer of respectability. But even their silence fed the gossip. For if there was nothing to hide, why never explain the man in the photographs? Why allow the rumors to spread, year after year, unchallenged? In time, the whispers became as much a part of the valley's history as the Thornfields' wealth. Guests attended their weddings with a mix of awe and dread, unsure if they were witnessing a family celebration or a ritual overseen by a figure who had outlived them all. The first grand wedding at the Thornfield estate took place in the spring of 1854, when the eldest son, Nathaniel, married a young woman from a neighboring county named Eliza Mercer. The union was meant to cement the Thornfields' growing influence, a match between two prominent families that drew guests from miles around. The house had only recently been completed, its brick walls and white-columned porch, a statement of permanence rising from the Arkansas soil. On that day, lanterns hung from the oak trees, musicians played on the veranda, and tables overflowed with food and wine. The family photographer captured the moment in a formal portrait, the bride standing with serene composure, her veil cascading to the floor. Yet behind her calm expression, Eliza carried a secret no one would know until after her death. She did not live to celebrate her first anniversary. In the winter of 1855, Eliza was found lifeless in her bedroom, her body pale and her features frozen as though she had been startled in her last breath. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, a common enough ailment in those years, but her passing sent ripples through the valley. Whispers began almost immediately, whispers that would cling to the Thornfield family for decades. Among her belongings was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the delicate handwriting of a young bride adjusting to her new life. At first, her entries were filled with descriptions of the house, her gratitude for its beauty, and her hopes for the future. But as the weeks passed, her tone shifted. She wrote of sleepless nights, of a constant sense of being watched even when she was alone. She described glimpses of a pale figure at the edge of her vision, standing near doorways, reflected faintly in mirrors, or motionless in the orchard beneath the moonlight. Most chilling were the entries that revealed her growing fear that no one else could see him. "Nathaniel laughs when I tell him," she wrote in late autumn. "He says the orchard is empty, but I know he is there. Always there. He was at the wedding. He has never left." In her final entry, written only days before her death, Eliza confessed, "I no longer know if he waits outside the window or if he lives in the house itself. He does not speak, yet I feel his claim upon me. They say I am blessed to have married into this family. I feel only that I have been given to him, the man no one else saw." The journal was quietly stored away by the Thornfields, never mentioned in public, but fragments of its contents slipped into local lore. To outsiders, Eliza's death was attributed to illness, yet those who had heard the truth whispered it differently. They said the first Thornfield bride had been marked from the moment her photograph was taken, her life claimed not by fever but by the presence who had already made himself part of the family record. The man hired to photograph the first Thornfield wedding in 1854 was a local artisan named Calvin Hodge, one of the few in the valley skilled with the fragile process of wet plate collodion. He was meticulous, known for the clarity of his work and for treating each photograph not as a commission but as a craft. It was Hodge who arranged the Thornfield family and their guests on that spring afternoon, who instructed them to hold their poses, to resist blinking, and to remain perfectly still while the plate was exposed. When the prints were delivered weeks later, everyone praised his work. The image was sharp, dignified, and captured the pride of a family entering its golden era. But in the privacy of his own studio, Hodge saw something that unsettled him to his core. In the margin of the plate, standing apart from the arranged figures, appeared the outline of a man he swore had never been there. Unlike the blurs that often marred long exposures, this figure was distinct. His face was pale, his outline firm, as though he had stood with absolute stillness. Hodge remembered every person he had posed that day, yet this man was not among them. When he showed the plate to his assistant, the young boy turned pale and muttered that it looked like someone had been burned into the glass. At first, Hodge dismissed it as a chemical accident, perhaps a residue of silver nitrate or a flaw in the collodion. But when he prepared duplicate exposures, the man appeared again. And when he later developed negatives from other Thornfield weddings, the figure returned each time, constant and unchanged. Hodge began to dread commissions from the family, dreading the hours in his dark room when the pale face would slowly emerge from the bath, solidifying into permanence on the fragile glass. In letters found years later among his belongings, Hodge confessed his growing fear. He wrote that he had destroyed half his negatives from the Thornfield commissions, shattering the glass plates against the stone floor rather than allow them to remain intact. "There is one among them," he wrote in 1862, "who does not belong. He arrives though unseen. He fixes himself upon the glass though no one stands before the lens. He cannot be erased. He is not trick of light or hand. He is burned into the plate as though the camera itself cannot refuse him." Hodge lived the remainder of his life in obscurity, taking fewer commissions and eventually abandoning photography altogether. Some claimed he was ruined by alcohol, others by madness, but his surviving letters tell a different story. He had seen something through his lens that no one else would admit to seeing, and it convinced him that his art was not merely capturing life, but something far more dangerous, an unwanted presence insistent on being remembered. When Jonathan Thornfield died unexpectedly in 1878, his young widow, Margaret, inherited not only the household but the carefully kept albums that documented decades of Thornfield prosperity. In public, she fulfilled her role with grace, attending church, receiving visitors, and overseeing the household with the quiet discipline expected of a matriarch. But within the privacy of her quarters, she began compiling an album of her own, one that differed sharply from the volumes displayed in the family parlor. This hidden book was bound in plain leather, its spine unmarked, and it contained only the wedding photographs. Each image was glued carefully to the page, but what made Margaret's collection remarkable was what she did to them. Across the face of the pale figure who appeared in every portrait, she had pressed dark strokes of ink, sometimes an X, sometimes a jagged smudge that nearly tore through the paper. In the margins, written in her narrow hand, were notes that spoke of fear rather than celebration. Beneath the first wedding portrait, she had scrawled, "He was there when I arrived, though no one invited him." In another, under the 1861 photograph, the words read simply, "The Shadow Guest." The pattern continued across every page. Though Margaret dutifully labeled the names of brides, grooms, and extended family, she returned always to the same figure, obscuring him with ink and annotating his presence. "He stands closer each time. No one else admits they see him. The children whispered his name, though we never told them." Her writing betrayed not just recognition, but obsession. A need to mark the stranger in some futile attempt to erase him from the record. Family lore suggests Margaret grew increasingly reclusive in her later years. Guests remembered her insisting that curtains remain drawn, and servants claimed she refused to walk through the orchard alone. Those who found her private album after her death in 1901 were unsettled by what it revealed. The Thornfields had always avoided speaking of the man in the photographs, choosing silence as their defense, but Margaret had broken the pattern. She did not deny him. She acknowledged him repeatedly, though only in private, and gave him a name that endured in whispered stories: the Shadow Guest. The album was never displayed publicly. It was locked away among her personal effects, passed quietly down through the family line. Yet its existence could not be hidden forever. When fragments of it were eventually revealed, it confirmed what many had only suspected. The Thornfields had not been blind to the figure in their photographs. At least one among them had seen him clearly and had lived her life beneath his gaze, recording her fear in ink across the very images meant to celebrate joy. The stories of the Thornfield estate are not carried only in ledgers and photographs, but in the words of its children, who were often less cautious about what they revealed. By the 1880s, several accounts emerged of Thornfield's sons and daughters, speaking of a figure they called Uncle Ellis. The name appeared suddenly, without explanation, and none of the adults could recall introducing such a person. Yet the children insisted he was real, a quiet man who played with them in the orchard, who appeared in the halls after dusk, and who stood at a distance during their lessons as if keeping watch. Servants were the first to notice the pattern. They heard the children whispering to one another about games they played with Uncle Ellis, games no one else seemed to witness. A maid remembered finding two of the Thornfield girls giggling in an upstairs corridor, staring at what she swore was empty air. When asked who they were speaking to, the girls pointed and replied in unison, "Uncle Ellis is telling us a story." The maid later confessed she resigned not long after, unsettled by the sense that the children were never alone, even when they should have been. The most disturbing evidence came from the children's drawings. In nursery rooms and at school desks, they sketched crude but consistent images of a tall man in dark clothing, his face gaunt, his hair neatly parted. Teachers remarked that, while most children's drawings shifted wildly in style and detail, every Thornfield child who mentioned Uncle Ellis drew him with uncanny similarity. When compared later to the wedding photographs, the likeness was unmistakable. The figure who had stood for decades in the background of the family portraits was the same one the children described as their mysterious playmate. Family members attempted to dismiss it as imagination. They claimed the children were inventing a character, perhaps influenced by tales overheard from servants or neighbors. But there was no explaining how each child, across multiple generations, produced drawings that matched a man whose name was never spoken in public and whose presence was carefully ignored by the adults. In one case, a boy of 6 drew Uncle Ellis with such detail that his sketch captured even the peculiar angle of the stranger's posture in the photographs. As though he had studied the image directly, though the album was kept locked away, far from children's eyes. As the years passed, the stories faded into whispers, and the children grew into adults who rarely admitted what they had seen. But the record of their drawings, some still preserved in family trunks, remains undeniable. To the young, unshielded by silence or denial, Uncle Ellis was not a rumor or an accident of the camera. He was a presence, familiar enough to be named, close enough to play with, and constant enough to be remembered in ink and paper long after childhood ended. The Thornfields' lives were closely bound to the church that stood at the center of their valley. Every Sunday their carriages arrived in a procession, and the family filled the first pew with polished shoes and immaculate collars. Their names appeared in donation lists, in baptism records, and in the gilded plaques that adorned the church walls. For all their influence, it seemed natural that the church would hold the most complete account of Thornfield history, from births to funerals to the grand weddings that drew entire congregations. Yet when researchers later combed through the archives, searching for mention of the pale man who appeared in every photograph, they found nothing: no baptism, no marriage license, no funeral notice. It was as if he had never lived at all. What made the absence more unsettling were the church bulletins. Preserved in bundles of yellowing paper, the programs from Thornfield weddings listed every participant: the minister, the choir, the musicians, even the flower bearers. And always, without fail, tucked at the bottom of the list, appeared a brief notation: one unnamed witness. At first, it seemed like a clerical oddity, perhaps a placeholder or an error repeated across decades. But the pattern was too consistent. From the first Thornfield wedding in 1854 to the last in 1921, the line remained unchanged. When questioned about it years later, church officials offered little explanation. Some claimed it was a formality, a symbolic acknowledgement of the presence of God. Others dismissed it as a long-standing tradition whose origins had been forgotten. But the language was peculiar: never the divine, never the spirit, but always one unnamed witness. Parishioners who remembered attending the weddings insisted that no such tradition existed for other families. The notation appeared only in the Thornfield records. Whispers spread among the congregation. Some suggested the Thornfields had demanded the phrase, that it was part of their influence over the church. Others whispered that the ministers themselves had seen the man, standing silent at the edge of every ceremony, and sought to acknowledge his presence without naming him outright. A former choir member, interviewed decades later, confessed that during a wedding in 1889, she had felt a chill at the back of the chapel and turned to see a man standing alone, watching the vows. When she asked later who he was, no one else admitted to noticing him. The Thornfields never spoke of the matter, and the church grew defensive when pressed. The archives remain intact, rows of bulletins with their unnerving repetition, a record that testifies not to faith, but to something unexplainable. No name was ever written, no origin ever given, yet in the official documents of the Valley's most sacred institution, the presence of the shadow guest was acknowledged again and again, hidden in plain sight beneath the words, "one unnamed witness." The Thornfield estate was built upon rituals of display, grand ceremonies, endless photographs, and celebrations that brought the Valley's community together. But beneath the veneer of joy, darker stories clung to the family. stories whispered with a shiver in kitchens and taverns. Among them were the vanishings, a series of tragedies that began to stain the Thornfield legacy in the latter half of the 19th century. 3 bridegrooms, each newly married into the family, disappeared within a year of their weddings, leaving behind widows who all spoke the same strange words. They said their husbands had followed the man into the orchard. The first was Thomas Avery, who married Clara Thornfield in 1861. By all accounts, he was a devoted husband, eager to prove himself worthy of his wife's inheritance. Less than a year after the wedding, Thomas vanished one autumn evening. Clara told her family he had been restless that day, standing often by the window that overlooked the orchard, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. When asked what he was watching, he answered, "The man who waits for me." Days later, after supper, he stepped out into the cool air and never returned. Search parties combed the orchards, fields, and riverbanks. Not a trace was found. 2 decades later, history repeated itself. In 1882, Robert Mallory wed Catherine Thornfield. Their marriage was celebrated with the same grandeur, the same photographs, and, though few admitted it aloud, the same pale figure appearing in the background of the portrait. Less than 12 months later, Robert was gone. Catherine, distraught, claimed she had awoken in the night to find him standing at the back door, staring into the orchard as though answering a summons. She pleaded with him to return to bed, but he only whispered, "He is calling me." Moments later, he walked into the trees and vanished. The search lasted weeks, yet no body, no clothing, no footprint was ever discovered. The third disappearance occurred in 1901 with Edward Harlan, husband to Margaret Thornfield's niece. His vanishing was preceded by weeks of peculiar behavior, long silences, sudden startles, and a refusal to enter certain rooms of the house. On the night of his disappearance, he was seen walking steadily toward the orchard after dinner, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed. His young wife chased after him but stopped short when she saw a figure waiting among the trees. She swore it was the same pale man from the wedding photographs. Edward reached the figure, and both slipped into the darkness. Neither emerged again. To the outside world, the Thornfields offered explanations, accidents, desertion, business gone wrong. But the widows, though hushed in public, admitted privately that their husbands had not left of their own accord. They had followed someone. They had followed the man into the orchard, and none had ever returned. When the Thornfield wedding album was finally examined by modern historians and photographic specialists, it was expected that the mystery of the pale figure might dissolve under the weight of science. Perhaps, they believed, the man was the product of double exposure or an accidental flaw caused by the unstable photographic techniques of the 19th century. Yet as each print and surviving glass plate was studied under magnification, the conclusion became more troubling. There was no evidence of tampering, no chemical irregularities, no hint that the figure was anything other than a subject captured in the same way as every other member of the party. Experts first noted the consistency of his presence. In every image, across decades, the figure appears in near-perfect focus, his outline as sharp as those of the bride and groom. He casts shadows where he should. His form obeys the natural fall of light, and his placement in the frame always suggests physical space. If he were a flaw of exposure, his image would be blurred or inconsistent. If he were a later addition, there would be signs of cutting, painting, or double printing. None were found. The man is as fixed in the emulsion as any Thornfield relative, as undeniable as the flowers in the bride's hands. What unsettled the analysts most was his constancy. In photographs spanning nearly 70 years, his features do not shift. The grooms grow older in successive portraits, the fashions change, the backgrounds alter as the estate evolves, but the man remains exactly the same. His jawline, his parted hair, the set of his shoulders all identical from one decade to the next. He does not grow older, nor does he grow younger. He simply persists, unchanged. Even his position within the photographs seems deliberate. He is never centered, never in the line of honor, but always just behind or beside the family group, placed where one might expect to find a distant cousin, a neighbor, or a hired hand. He is close enough to be part of the gathering yet always removed, a fraction outside the warmth of the family circle. In one photograph from 1889, he stands directly behind the bride, his face hovering above her veil like a shadow cast in daylight. In another from 1907, he is at the edge of the group, his gaze turned toward the orchard behind the house. The final assessment of the experts, published quietly in an academic journal, admitted the anomaly. The figure was present, undeniably real within the limits of the photographic process, yet absent from all records of the living. The conclusion was clinical but unnerving. The photographs did not lie. Whoever the man was, he stood among the Thornfields for 7 decades, preserved in their most intimate family moments, yet untouched by the passage of time. Guests at Thornfield weddings often remembered the grandeur of the ceremonies, the lanterns strung through the oak trees, the polished carriages lined at the gate, the way the family seemed to command every detail of the occasion. Yet, among the stories passed down, another detail emerged with uneasy regularity. There was always mention of a man in black, a somber figure who appeared without introduction, lingered just long enough to be seen, and departed before the celebrations reached their height. He was remembered not for words spoken but for silence, for the way his presence seemed to chill the air around him. Accounts vary, but the threads weave together into a disturbing consistency. At the 1872 wedding of Jonathan Thornfield's daughter, a guest later told her grandchildren of a tall man standing near the church entrance, dressed in black from coat to gloves, watching the procession without moving. When she asked who he was, another guest shrugged and replied that he must have been a distant cousin. Yet when the feast began and the family gathered at the estate, he was nowhere to be found. At the 1889 wedding of Clara Thornfield, several attendees recalled the same figure. He stood near the back row during the vows, his face pale beneath the shadow of his hat, and when the guests spilled into the reception, he was gone. "I never saw him eat, nor drink, nor speak," one witness later wrote in a private letter. He was there, and then he was not, as though his purpose had been completed once the words were spoken. The most unsettling testimony came from a servant who worked the 1907 wedding. She remembered opening the door for a man dressed in black who entered without greeting. He stood quietly in the corner during the family photograph, eyes fixed on the bride, and slipped away before she could ask his name. When she mentioned him later to the other staff, they looked at her blankly. None had seen him. Despite these accounts, no invitation lists bear his name. No records of lodging or travel mention him. He seemed to appear only at Thornfield weddings, never at funerals, never at community gatherings, never at harvest feasts. The family, when pressed, deflected the questions with polite dismissal. Yet those who attended the ceremonies could not shake the memory of his gaze steady, watchful, and heavy with unspoken meaning. He was not a guest in the ordinary sense. He was an observer who came for the vows alone, as though the promises spoken at the altar bound not only bride and groom but him as well. And once they were made, he vanished, leaving behind only the uneasy certainty that he had been there at all. Behind the Thornfield estate stretched a wide orchard, rows of trees planted with deliberate care, their branches arching in neat lines that caught the moonlight like skeletal hands. To visiting eyes, it was a fine piece of land, the sort of planting that promised abundance and symbolized prosperity. Yet those who lived nearby knew it differently. The orchard bore no fruit. Season after season, its blossoms came and went, but the branches never yielded apples, pears, or plums. Children dared one another to run its rows at dusk, but even the bravest admitted that the silence there felt unnatural, as though the orchard itself were listening. By nightfall, no locals lingered within its boundaries. The Thornfield ledgers tell a curious story. Year after year, the family paid for pruning, soil enrichment, and the wages of laborers tasked with its upkeep. Considerable sums were recorded for fertilizer, irrigation, and the replacement of trees, yet nowhere in the accounts is there mention of a harvest. There were no entries for fruit taken to market, no notes of barrels packed for sale or storage. It was as if the orchard existed not for production, but for preservation. It was maintained carefully, even obsessively, though it gave nothing in return. At the orchard's center stood a stone. Weathered and pale, it rose from the earth with no inscription, no carving to mark it as grave or monument. Family tradition claimed it was merely a boundary marker, a remnant of the land's earliest survey, but its position suggested otherwise. The rows of trees seemed to radiate outward from it, their pattern oriented as though the stone were the true heart of the orchard. Servants who tended the grounds spoke of feeling watched while working near it, and some claimed their tools broke or dulled faster there. A few refused outright to go near, muttering of shadows that lingered at its base long after dusk had fallen. Visitors at weddings sometimes wandered into the orchard, unaware of its reputation, only to return uneasy and subdued. They described the air as heavy, the birds silent, the leaves unmoving even when the wind stirred the fields beyond. Some said the stone appeared larger up close than it had from a distance, as though it expanded in the approach, crowding the ground around it. No explanation was ever offered, at least not publicly, but in the valley the orchard became synonymous with absence. It was a place of careful tending without return, of deliberate upkeep without reward. Over time, the locals avoided even glancing at it when they passed the Thornfield property. They believed the orchard belonged not to the family but to the figure who appeared in the photographs, that the trees were his boundary and the stone his anchor. Whatever bargains had been struck on Thornfield land, the orchard remained their silent reminder, a place carefully maintained but never spoken of, where fruit never ripened, and where no one dared to linger after dark. Among the fragile papers preserved in the Thornfield estate's locked chest, researchers discovered a letter written in 1812, decades before the first of the haunting wedding photographs. It was penned by Elias Thornfield himself, the family patriarch, and addressed to his younger brother who had settled further east. The letter was written in a hurried hand, uneven and almost fevered, as though Elias feared his words might outpace the ink. It spoke of hardship, failed crops, mounting debts, and the looming threat of losing the land that had only just been claimed. But then, the tone shifted. Elias wrote that he had been offered a solution, a bargain not in coin or contract, but in blood. The letter described a night in the orchard, long before it had been planted with rows of trees. Elias wrote of standing before a stone half buried in the soil, its surface slick with rain, while another man, not quite stranger, not quite kin, presented him with a knife. The bargain was simple in its cruelty. In exchange for prosperity, the family would be bound to welcome the guest at every wedding, ensuring his presence was acknowledged, whether named or not. Elias admitted he did not fully understand who or what the guest was, but desperation outweighed doubt. With his hand cut open and blood staining the stone, he made the oath. What followed in the years after seemed to validate his choice. The land, once stubborn, yielded crops in abundance. The Thornfields, previously teetering on ruin, found themselves rising to prominence. By the 1830s, they had become one of the most respected families in the valley, their influence felt in church pews, markets, and county meetings. Elias, in later correspondence, referred to the bargain as our safeguard, insisting that their prosperity was not natural fortune, but fulfillment of a pact. Yet there were hints of unease even in his words. He warned his brother that the oath could not be broken, that to deny the guest entry into their celebrations would be to invite ruin. He must stand with us, Elias wrote, as witness and keeper of our bond. So long as we honor him, our wealth endures. If we should fail, so shall we. The phrasing suggested not reverence, but fear. as though Elias recognized too late that he had not merely secured prosperity, but bound his descendants to something far darker. When the family letter was finally uncovered in the 20th century, it cast the photographs in a different light. The pale man who appeared in every wedding was not accidental, nor uninvited. He was expected, awaited, a figure bound by oath to stand at each union as proof of the promise made in blood. The Thornfields' legacy of wealth and prominence was built not on hard labor alone, but on a pact that demanded their silence, and on the unshakable presence of the guest who never aged and never left. In the county archive, where births, deaths, and land deeds were preserved in neat rows of boxes and bound volumes, there had once been a separate collection dedicated to photographs of the valley's earliest families. Among them were the Thornfield wedding portraits, carefully catalogued, their fragile glass negatives stored in padded sleeves. The archivists treated these with pride, for they were not only family relics but historical documents of the region's growth. Yet in 1902, the most curious of these records, the last known original glass plate bearing the pale figure who haunted every Thornfield photograph, vanished without explanation. The disappearance was never logged as a theft. No locks were broken, no cabinets forced, and no record exists of an official investigation. Instead, the matter was quietly noted in the margin of the archive's inventory as missing, presumed misplaced. But those who had handled the negative before its vanishing were adamant it had not simply been lost. Only months earlier, a visiting academic had examined the plate under magnification and remarked upon its clarity. He noted that the pale figure was captured in unnerving sharpness, more defined even than the bride and groom at the photograph's center. The archivist who assisted him recalled the man's unease, how he had stepped back from the lens and muttered, "This is no accident of exposure." Weeks later, the plate was gone. Whispers spread through the valley. Some claimed the Thornfield family themselves had arranged for the negative's removal, unwilling to let outsiders scrutinize what they had long chosen to ignore. Others believed the plate had been taken by someone outside the family. A collector of curiosities who understood its value lay not in genealogy but in the uncanny. There were darker suggestions, too, that the figure in the photograph, the guest who appeared without fail, did not intend to be studied so closely and had seen to the matter himself. What unsettled those who remembered the negative most was the silence that followed. Unlike other lost items, no attempt was made to reproduce or recover it. Requests for access were quietly denied, and visitors were redirected to prints of lesser quality. Over time, the absence of the plate itself became more disturbing than its contents. It was the only surviving negative to vanish from the collection, leaving behind only the prints, whose faded clarity could not capture the figure with the same sharpness. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the vanishing negative had taken on the shape of legend. Archivists would lower their voices when asked about it, admitting only that it had disappeared without trace. The official record still marks it as missing, a word that suggests error rather than intent. Yet, for those who study the Thornfield legacy, the missing plate is not a clerical oversight. It is evidence of the one moment when the silent guest was captured too clearly, and when the proof of his presence was quietly erased from public view. Among the carefully maintained silences of the Thornfield estate, the voices of two brides broke through, though only in the smallest of whispers. Their confessions were never written in the family albums or entered into church records, but they lingered in private correspondence and in the recollections of confidants who dared repeat them decades later. Both women, married into the Thornfield line, described the same unsettling experience. In the months leading up to their weddings, they dreamed of the man who would one day stand in their photographs, the figure no one else dared acknowledge. The first was Clara Thornfield, married in 1889. In letters preserved by her cousin, she wrote of nights filled with restless visions. She described walking down the aisle of the family chapel, only to find, waiting at the altar, not her fiancé but a tall, pale stranger in black. His face never changed, his eyes fixed on her with a solemn weight that left her breathless upon waking. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, the anxiety of a young woman preparing to Wednesday. But the dream returned, night after night, always ending the same way with her standing before the stranger, unable to move, unable to speak. By the week of her wedding, she confessed to her cousin that she dreaded the ceremony, not because of her groom, but because she was certain the man from her dreams would be there, watching. 3 decades later, another bride echoed her words. In 1919, Eleanor Hart, who married into the Thornfield family through James Thornfield, admitted privately to her sister that she had endured the same haunting visions. She too dreamed of standing at the altar with the stranger. In her account, the church was empty except for him, his figure looming beside the unmarked stone from the orchard, which somehow appeared within the walls of the sanctuary. He did not move, did not speak, but he was always waiting. Eleanor confided that by the time her wedding day approached, she no longer feared the stranger's presence but felt resigned to it, as though the marriage were not only to her groom but to him as well. Neither Clara nor Eleanor ever spoke of these dreams in public, but the fragments that survived reveal a chilling continuity. Across 30 years, two Thornfield brides dreamed the same vision of a man who stood at the altar before they ever stepped into the church. When the photographs were taken, and when they later saw his pale face fixed among the guests, both women fell silent. It was not surprise they felt, but recognition. They had seen him long before the camera captured him, always waiting, as though their vows had been spoken not only before God and family, but before the keeper of the Thornfield promise himself. The last Thornfield wedding was held in the summer of 1921, a ceremony meant to display the family's enduring prominence even as whispers about their strange legacy thickened in the valley. The estate, though aging, was still formidable. Lanterns hung once more from the sprawling oaks, the chapel bells rang, and guests arrived in carriages and early automobiles to witness what would become the final union on Thornfield land. The bride, Eleanor Hart Thornfield, stood radiant in a lace gown, her groom at her side, both captured in the now customary group photograph. When the print returned from the photographer's studio, there was no surprise in what it revealed. Standing just behind the couple, as he had for nearly 70 years, was the same pale man, his features unchanged, his posture solemn, his presence as sharp and undeniable as ever. By this point, no member of the family commented on it. The image was placed in the album alongside its predecessors, and the silence surrounding the figure deepened into something like ritual acceptance. He had been at every wedding since 1854, and he was at the last. Only weeks later, the Thornfield estate was reduced to ash. The fire began late in the night, starting in the east wing and spreading rapidly through the wooden beams that had supported the grand house since its completion. Servants and family members fled into the orchard, watching helplessly as flames devoured the home that had stood for nearly a century. By dawn, little remained but charred walls and the blackened outline of the chimneys. No cause was ever determined. Some claimed faulty wiring had sparked the blaze, though the house had only recently been outfitted with electricity. Others whispered of arson, though no culprit was ever found. Among the locals, however, the explanation was different. They said the promise had ended, that the family's pact had reached its natural conclusion, and the house, bound by that oath, had been consumed once its purpose was fulfilled. What made the fire even more striking was its timing. The 1921 wedding photograph became the last image ever taken of the Thornfield family together. No later weddings were recorded. No new portraits added to the album. Survivors of the blaze scattered, some leaving the valley altogether, and the estate was never rebuilt. The land remained, but the great house that had once been its heart was gone, leaving only the orchard, the stone at its center, and the album of photographs preserved by distant descendants. The final wedding stands as a closing chapter, not only of the Thornfield lineage but of the long, unsettling presence that had shadowed them. The pale man appeared for the last time in that photograph, his face unchanged, his gaze steady. After the fire, no more images were taken. Whether he departed with the flames or remains bound to the land, no one can say. But with the destruction of the estate, the silence that had surrounded him for generations deepened, and the photographs became the only surviving record of his watch over the Thornfields, ending as abruptly as the house that once contained their legacy. In 1956, a regional historian conducting interviews for a project on Arkansas family lineages sought out one of the last surviving members of the Thornfield bloodline. She was an elderly woman named Abigail Thornfield, nearly 80 by then, who lived quietly in a modest boarding house far from the valley where her family's estate had once stood. Frail but sharp-eyed, she agreed to speak only after the historian promised her words would not be published during her lifetime. What she revealed was not the expected recollections of wealth, land, or heritage, but a confession that cast the family's silence in a darker light. Abigail admitted that the man who appeared in every Thornfield wedding photograph was no mystery to her. The family had a name for him, whispered behind locked doors: the debt collector. According to her account, he was not a man in the ordinary sense but a figure bound to them by a bargain made long before her birth. She said that each generation was told the story privately, a right of inheritance more binding than land deeds or wills. The Thornfields' prosperity, their rise from near ruin to prominence, had been purchased at a cost. "He came when they called," she murmured, her voice trembling. "And he never left, not until the line is finished." She described how the family learned early never to speak of him outside their walls. To acknowledge him publicly was to invite his attention more directly. Yet even in silence, his presence was inescapable. Children were warned never to wander alone into the orchard. Brides were prepared with whispered counsel that their vows would be witnessed by more than God or family. Grooms were cautioned to show no fear when the stranger appeared among the guests. "The debt collector comes for the promises," Abigail said. "He stands at the altar because it was promised he would. Until the last Thornfield is gone, he will not release us." The historian pressed her for detail, but Abigail grew increasingly withdrawn, her hands twisting in her lap as though she regretted speaking at all. She admitted that she had avoided marriage, fearing that bringing another ceremony to life would summon him once more. "I have lived alone so he would not come for me," she confessed. "I thought perhaps if there were no weddings the bargain would weaken. But I know better. He waits." Her testimony was recorded, filed away with the rest of the historian's notes, and only surfaced decades later. By then, Abigail was long dead, and the Thornfield name had all but disappeared. Her words, however, endure as the only direct acknowledgement from within the family itself. To her, the pale man was no ghost, no trick of light, but the living embodiment of a pact, an enforcer of promises sealed in blood, destined to appear until the final branch of the Thornfield tree was cut away. The Thornfield Cemetery lies on a rise overlooking what remains of the estate, a small enclosure ringed by rusting iron gates and shaded by trees whose roots press up against the soil. Here the family's history is etched in stone, rows of weathered headstones bearing names that once carried weight in the valley. The markers span nearly a century, recording births, marriages, and deaths with the solemn finality of carved dates. Yet even a cursory glance reveals something amiss. The sequence of graves, so carefully arranged, contains gaps where stones should stand. Entire generations of grooms and brides are absent, their names present in marriage records, but nowhere in the earth that was meant to receive them. Researchers who studied the cemetery noted these absences with growing unease. The 3 grooms who vanished within a year of their weddings left no memorials here. Their wives were interred beneath marble markers, but the spaces beside them remained conspicuously empty. Other Thornfield brides who died young were likewise unrecorded. In total, at least 6 family members appear in church registers and legal documents, but lack any headstone in the family plot. The Thornfields, known for their fastidious record-keeping, would not have simply forgotten. These omissions suggested something deliberate, an erasure carried out not in paper but in stone. In the late 20th century, when interest in the Thornfield mystery revived, a team of researchers conducted ground-penetrating surveys of the land surrounding the estate. The results were troubling. Beneath the orchard, in the shadow of the unmarked central stone, anomalies appeared, shapes and densities consistent with shallow graves. Though the exact number could not be determined, the scans indicated multiple disturbances in the soil, aligned in uneven rows as though bodies had been interred without ceremony. Local legend long held that the orchard was more than a field of barren trees, that it served as the true resting place for those touched by the Thornfield curse. The widows who claimed their husbands had followed the pale man into the orchard spoke of never seeing them again, and the absence of headstones lent weight to their words. If the missing grooms and brides were buried, it was not among kin in consecrated ground, but beneath the trees that never bore fruit. The valley's elders say that on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the orchard, the sound resembles voices carried low, as if the missing Thornfields still linger there, bound to the oath made generations earlier. Their absence from the cemetery is not an oversight, but a testament to the family's bargain, a reminder that some debts are not recorded in stone, but in silence and in earth that refuses to yield its secrets. Today, the Thornfield wedding album rests not in the hands of descendants but behind glass and lock in the archives of a regional museum, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. The pages, brittle with age, hold the sequence of photographs that chart nearly 70 years of family unions. Each image is carefully mounted, labeled in elegant handwriting, and accompanied by dates that trace the rise and fall of the Thornfields. Yet the album has become less a genealogical treasure and more a relic of unease. For within every frame, from the first photograph in 1854 to the last in 1921, the same pale figure appears, as present and unchanged as if time itself had no hold on him. Archivists admit the album exists, but they do not welcome questions. The collection is technically accessible to researchers, yet requests to view the Thornfield album are often delayed, restricted, or denied outright. Those who have been permitted a glimpse describe the same unnerving detail: the man in black, sometimes at the edge of the group, sometimes hovering just behind the bride or groom, always sharp, always watching. The photographs, once explained away as curiosities of old equipment, are now preserved with a reverence that feels closer to fear than scholarship. What unsettles visitors most are the accounts of change. Several researchers claim that when they turned back to earlier pages, the stranger no longer stood where they had first seen him. In one instance, a woman swore the man who had been in the far row during the 1872 wedding now appeared at the bride's shoulder, his face nearer, clearer, as though he had moved closer to the heart of the image. Others reported subtle shifts in his expression, a faint tightening of the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. No official acknowledgement of these claims has ever been made, and archivists respond with silence when pressed, their refusal itself a kind of confirmation. The museum's staff maintain the photographs under controlled conditions, yet stories persist among employees of footsteps in the closed reading room, of faint impressions on chairs where no one has Saturday. Some refuse to handle the album at all, insisting that the figure seems to watch not only from the page, but through it, his gaze unbroken across the decades. For the public, the Thornfield album has become an artifact of dread, a collection less about family history than about the persistence of something that should not exist. The pale man, never named, never explained, endures in every photograph, unchanged. The family who once welcomed him is gone, their estate reduced to ash, their graves scattered, but the album remains. And within its pages, the silent witness still stands, waiting, as if the promise forged in blood has not yet reached its end.